The day my director leaned back in his leather chair and told me I was lucky to still have a job, I slid a USB drive across his desk and said, "Thank you for the opportunity." He had no idea what was on it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Claire, and for 11 years, I was the senior project coordinator at a mid-sized architecture firm in Vancouver. We designed commercial buildings, mixed-use developments, transit hubs, the kind of projects that shape how a city feels when you walk through it. I loved that work. I loved it the way you love something that asks everything from you and occasionally, on a good day, gives a little back. I started at the firm when I was 31. Fresh out of a contract position with a municipal planning office, 2 years of part-time grad school still sitting on my resume like a badge I'd half-earned. The firm wasn't glamorous, but it was serious. The kind of place where people stayed for decades, where institutional knowledge moved through the office like weather. I told myself I'd stay 5 years, learn everything I could, and move on. 11 years later, I was still there, but I wasn't the same person who'd walked in. Over those years, I had built the project coordination system from scratch. Before me, deadlines were tracked on printed spreadsheets pinned to corkboards. Client communication was handled through whoever happened to pick up the phone. Subcontractor scheduling was, generously, chaos. I digitized everything. I built the workflow templates that every project manager in the office still used. When we landed our first federal infrastructure contract, a transit hub in Burnaby worth $42 million, it was my coordination framework that kept it on track. My director at the time, a quiet man named Robert, who retired the year before all of this happened, told me in his last performance review that I was the operational backbone of the firm. He meant it as a compliment. I understand now that it was also a cage. When Robert retired, the partners brought in a new director from Toronto. His name was Daniel, and he arrived in January with a relocation package, a reputation for modernizing firms, and an energy that filled every room he entered before he did. He was 44, polished in a way that read as confidence until you spent enough time around him to realize it was performance. He had opinions about everything and knowledge about almost nothing specific to how we actually operated. In his first week, he sat in on every team meeting without speaking. I thought he was absorbing. I learned later, he was cataloging. He started making changes in February. Small ones at first, renaming departments, restructuring the weekly reporting format, insisting that all client-facing communication route through him before going out. I adapted. I told myself that every new director needed to put their fingerprints on things. I showed him how our systems worked, walked him through the templates I'd built, explained the history behind every process. He nodded, took notes on his iPad, and thanked me for my patience. By March, he had hired a new project associate. Her name was Vanessa, and she was 27, smart, and had absolutely no context for how our firm operated. She'd come from a design consultancy in Calgary where she had coordinated small residential projects. She was talented, clearly, but she walked in knowing roughly 15% of what the role she was stepping into required. Daniel introduced her to the team at an all-hands meeting as a fresh perspective and a future leader of this organization. He said it while looking at her. I noticed he did not look at me. Over the following weeks, I watched him quietly transfer pieces of my work to Vanessa. Not officially. Not with any announcement. He would copy her on emails that used to come only to me. He would ask her to sit in on client calls I had been running for years. Once, he sent her alone to a site visit for a project I had coordinated from the proposal stage. She called me from the parking lot beforehand, voice low, asking me to walk her through what to expect. I did. The client report that came back had her name on it. I told myself I was being generous. That I was mentoring. That this was what good senior staff did. But by May, I had stopped believing that. The moment I stopped being able to pretend happened on a Thursday afternoon. We had a standing check-in with the partners every 2 weeks, a meeting I had attended for 9 of my 11 years. That Thursday, I walked to the boardroom at the usual time and found the door closed. Through the glass, I could see Daniel, Vanessa, and 2 of the 3 partners sitting at the table. The third partner, Marian, was standing in the hallway beside me. She looked at me with something careful in her face. Daniel asked me to let you know the format is changing, she said. Going forward, he'll be bringing Vanessa to these. He feels it's important for her development. I asked if I was still expected to prepare the coordination updates for the meeting. Marian didn't answer right away. He'll let you know. she said finally. I walked back to my desk, sat down, and opened my email. There was a message from Daniel sent 40 minutes earlier. The subject line was check-in structure update. It was 4 sentences. It said that going forward, project coordination updates would be handled by Vanessa, that this was part of a broader realignment of responsibilities, and that he appreciated my continued support during the transition. Transition to what, he did not say. I sat with that email for a long time. Long enough for the office to empty out around me, for the light outside the window to shift from afternoon to early evening, for the cleaning staff to come through and vacuum around my chair. I thought about 11 years. I thought about the transit hub in Burnaby, still standing, still running on schedules I had built. I thought about the partners' retreat in Whistler 2 years ago, where I had managed the logistics for 40 people while simultaneously handling a subcontractor crisis on an active project. I thought about every time someone in that office had quietly called me when something was falling apart, because they knew I would fix it. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop. I titled it with a date. And I started paying very close attention. I want to be clear about something. I am not a dramatic person. I grew up in a household in Kamloops where problems were handled quietly, where you did not make scenes, where endurance was treated as a form of dignity. My mother worked for 23 years at the same credit union branch, and never once raised her voice at a manager. I understood that instinct. I had lived it for 11 years. But there is a difference between dignity and disappearance. And what Daniel was doing systematically, methodically, with a smile was making me disappear. So I paid attention. I started keeping a private log. Not on my work computer. On a personal laptop I brought in my bag and used during lunch breaks in the small courtyard behind the building. I documented every meeting I was excluded from, every email that redirected my responsibilities without explanation. Every time a piece of work I had done appeared in a presentation under someone else's name, I noted dates, times, names, the exact language used. I wrote down the Burnaby project updates that went to Vanessa even though my name was still on the contract documents. I wrote down the time Daniel introduced me to a new client as his administrative support. I had been the senior project coordinator for 11 years. I had never been administrative support. I also started talking to people. Quietly. There were 4 other long-term staff members at the firm, people who had been there 8 years or more, and I was not the only one noticing things. One of the senior architects, a man named Paul who had worked there since before I arrived, told me over coffee one afternoon that 2 of his design concepts from the previous quarter had shown up in Daniel's presentation to a Vancouver City committee, credited to the firm generically. Not to Paul. I asked him if he'd said anything. He laughed, short and without humor. To who? That was a fair question. The partners, there were 3 of them, all founding members, all in their late 60s, had largely handed day-to-day operations to Daniel. Marion was the most engaged, but she had been managing her own health situation for the past year and was less present than usual. The other 2 were focused on business development and seemed to trust that Daniel's modernization was producing results. On paper, it looked like it was. The firm had landed 2 new contracts since January. What the partners did not see was who was actually doing the work underneath those wins. I began to understand that Daniel had made a calculated bet. He had arrived at a firm where the operational knowledge was concentrated in a small number of experienced staff, all of whom were professional enough not to cause problems. He could take credit for the infrastructure they had built, transfer the visible pieces to his own protégé, and by the time anyone noticed, he would have enough wins on his record to move on. That was his plan. Mine was different. In July, something happened that changed the timeline. We had a major project milestone review for a mixed-use development in North Vancouver, a project I had coordinated from the initial RFP response. The client was a developer, and the review was with their full executive team. Daniel had asked me 3 weeks prior to prepare the coordination documentation, schedule summaries, subcontractor, status reports, municipal approval tracking. I spent 2 weeks on it. It was thorough. It was the best version of work I had done in years. Partly because I was being careful, and partly because I still cared, even then. The morning of the review, I arrived early. I set up the boardroom. I placed the documentation packages at each seat. I connected the presentation laptop and tested the display. Daniel arrived at 8:50 with Vanessa. He looked at the packages on the table, picked one up, flipped through it, and put it back down. "Good work on this," he said. Then, to Vanessa. "You want to walk them through the schedules section today? Good practice." Vanessa looked at me. There was something in her expression I could not entirely read, not quite guilt, not quite apology. She was not the villain of this situation. She was 27 and being handed things by someone with authority. I had been that person once too. "Sure," she said quietly. The client arrived at 9. Daniel opened the meeting. He introduced the team. He said, "Vanessa has been leading our coordination effort on this project and will walk you through the status documentation." The client's project director, a woman named Susan, looked at her package and then looked at me. I had been in 4 previous meetings with Susan. She knew my name. She knew my work. "Claire put this together," Susan said. It was not quite a question. "It's a team effort," Daniel said, and smiled, and moved on. I sat in that meeting for 90 minutes and did not say a word that wasn't directly asked of me. On the inside, something had gone very still and very clear. When the client left, I returned to my desk, opened my personal laptop, and wrote down everything that had just happened. Then I wrote an email not sent, just drafted to a labor lawyer, whose name I had looked up 2 weeks earlier, after a late-night Google search that had started with workplace credits being taken by manager, and ended with constructive dismissal Canada. I did not send it yet. But I wrote it. Over the following 6 weeks, I built a case that I am still, honestly, a little proud of. I requested copies of all project documents I had contributed to under the firm's internal file sharing system. I was still entitled to access them, and I made sure to download time-stamped versions that showed my authorship in the metadata. I compiled every email chain where my work was referenced without credit. I pulled meeting invitations showing the pattern of my exclusion. I took careful notes every time Daniel made a comment in front of colleagues that minimized my role or redirected attention to Vanessa. I also talked to Susan. Susan had asked for a separate check-in about the North Vancouver project standard practice, and since Daniel left that kind of client communication to me when it was logistical, I handled it. At the end of the call, she asked directly how things were going internally. I was honest with her, professionally and carefully. I did not make accusations. I described patterns. I told her that I had some concerns about how project attribution was being managed, and that I was in the process of addressing them formally. Susan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've worked with a lot of firms over the years, Claire. I know what a coordination framework looks like when it's built by one person. Yours has been on this project from the beginning." She asked me to keep her informed. I said I would. In September, Daniel called me into his office. He closed the door, which he rarely did. He told me that the firm was doing a role realignment and that my position was being restructured. He said that my coordination responsibilities would be consolidated under Vanessa, and that he was offering me a revised role as a project support specialist, a title 2 levels below my current one, with a corresponding salary reduction of roughly $18,000 annually. He presented it as an evolution of the organization. He said I should think about it over the weekend and let him know on Monday. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my mother and her 23 years at the credit union. I thought about the folder on my personal laptop. I thought about the draft email to the labor lawyer, still sitting unsent. "Thank you," I said. "I'll think about it." I did not think about it over the weekend. I sent the email. The lawyer's name was Patricia. She was in her 50s, direct, and had been practicing employment law in BC for over 20 years. We met for an hour on a Friday morning at her office near Broadway and Cambie. I brought everything printed and organized, because I had been preparing this folder in my mind for months before I ever started filling it. She read through it while I sat across from her, and she did not rush. When she looked up, she said, "This is constructive dismissal. And this is a well-documented case." She also said something else. She said that the metadata on those documents, the authorship timestamps, the version histories was the kind of evidence that was often underestimated and very difficult to dispute. She said firms like this one typically preferred settlement to litigation, because litigation meant discovery, and discovery meant everything came out. She recommended we send a formal letter before taking any further steps. Give them the opportunity to respond. That was standard. That was also, she said, how you found out quickly what you were actually dealing with. The letter went to the firm's legal counsel the following Thursday. I was not in the office when it arrived, but I know from Paul, who heard it from one of the administrative staff, that Daniel was called into a meeting with the partners within an hour of its receipt. The meeting lasted most of the afternoon. Marian called me personally that evening. She asked if we could meet before I came back to the office. Her voice was careful and tired in a way I had not heard before. We met at a coffee shop near the seawall on Monday morning. She came without Daniel. She brought one of the other partners, a man named Jeffrey, who had always been the quietest of the three. They both looked like people who had spent the weekend reading documents they wished they had read sooner. Marian said, "We were not aware of the extent of what was happening." I said, "I know." She asked what I needed. I had thought about this. I had thought about it very carefully, because I understood that what I asked for in that moment would define what came next, not just legally, but for me. In the way I would feel about this chapter of my life when it was over. I did not ask to stay. I had spent a long time in a place that had made itself clear, and I had learned what I needed to learn. I did not ask for Daniel to be humiliated, though I will not pretend the thought hadn't occurred to me. I asked for 4 things. A severance package calculated on 11 years of service at my current salary, in line with the upper range of what was standard under BC employment law. A formal written acknowledgement from the firm that I was the primary author and developer of the coordination framework currently in use, suitable for inclusion in my professional portfolio. A professional reference letter, signed by all 3 partners. And a clause ensuring that no negative information about my departure would be communicated to any future employer or professional contact. Marian looked at Jeffrey. Jeffrey looked at Marian. "We can do that," Marian said. The acknowledgement letter was the thing I had not expected to want as much as I did. When it arrived signed, on firm letterhead, specific about every project and every system, I read it 3 times standing in my kitchen in my coat, grocery bags still on the counter. It said, in formal and careful language, what I had known for 11 years and been asked, gradually, and then all at once, to pretend wasn't true. Daniel left the firm 6 weeks later. I heard through Paul that the partners had found, in the course of their own review, that he had been taking credit for work, not just mine, in communications with potential clients. That he had been building a personal profile on the back of the firm's existing reputation, without disclosing that the methodology he was presenting as his own had been developed by staff who predated him. One of those potential clients had apparently been about to make a referral decision based on a capability presentation that was, substantively, fiction. I don't know exactly what happened in those conversations. I wasn't there, but I know he left, and I know the firm had to do a significant amount of client communication in the months that followed to repair certain relationships. Susan, as it turned out, did not need repairing. She called me directly in November. She had tracked down my personal email through a mutual contact and told me that her company was about to issue an RFP for a new development and that she wanted to know if I was interested in submitting as an independent coordinator. I had been thinking about that possibility since September. I had done the math. With the severance, I had 8 months of runway. I had 11 years of documented experience, a portfolio that was now formally attributed to me, and a network of subcontractors and municipal contacts that I had built myself. I had been afraid, quietly, for a long time, afraid that I needed the firm more than it needed me, afraid that the institutional walls around me were protection rather than constraint. I said yes to Susan. My coordination practice has been operating for 7 months now. I work from a small office I share with 2 other independent contractors near Main Street. I have 3 active clients, one of whom found me through a referral from Paul, who left the firm himself in the spring. My income this year will not match what I was making in September, but it will be close, and next year the math looks different. I think about my mother sometimes, and her 23 years. I think she was braver than I gave her credit for staying in a place, doing good work, building something, and also that she deserved better than the credit union gave her. I think both of those things can be true. What I handed Daniel, in the end, was not a confrontation. It was a record. 11 years of work, time-stamped, attributed, organized into a folder that said, I was here, I built this, and I know exactly what it is worth. He never saw it coming, because he had never believed it existed. It had always existed. I had just stopped pretending otherwise.